Hello, welcome everybody. It is nice to see you today. Happy Thursday. I am Rachel Scheinerman and have the pleasure of hosting this Daf Yomi week in 30-minute review class. I also have the pleasure of editing My Jewish Learning and a daily dose of Talmud. And we have lots of wonderful teachers who come in to review what we have learned in the Daf this week. And we are getting there with Tractate Sanhedrin. We are rounding the corner toward the end. It takes quite an interesting turn at the very end. We're not quite there yet at the last chapter, but we're getting there. So now that I've filled some air for a few minutes and hopefully brought everybody in from the waiting room, let me introduce Rabbi Elliot Goldberg, who's going to steer us through what we saw in the Daf this week.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Good morning from all over the place. Purim Sameach, as Purim is coming. And for those who are fasting today, I hope you have an easy fast. It's interesting. I've been thinking about this, Rachel, not connected to what we're going to look at today, but you said like the Masechah takes a turn for the last chapter, which it does. In the Mishnah, however, the order of the chapters is reversed at the end. So chapter 11, which we're coming to, is actually chapter 10 in the Mishnah. And the chapter we're studying now is actually the last chapter in the Mishnah. So it's kind of interesting that the Talmud flips the order of the chapters. In some ways, there's some continuity now by finishing up this discussion that we've been having about all the different kinds of things you could do that get that merit you isn't exactly the right word, that get you for which you could be convicted of the death penalty. In the Mishnah, it's a little choppier because the last chapter, which has a different subject matter, precedes the one we're studying now. Anyways, that's a tangential aside. Let's get started because the half hour goes quick. It's good to see everybody. I'm going to put a link to my slides here in the chat. Oh, there we go. Came up twice.
Sorry, I did too.
That's all right. You could use either link. They're both just as good, I believe. And I'm going to share my screen and we are going to dig in. Here we go. All right. So we started chapter 10 this week, and that starts with a Mishnah that has a whole list of, right? The Mishnah starts by saying these are the transgressions. These are the transgressors who are strangled in the implementation of court-imposed death. Were strangled in the implementation of the court-imposed death penalty, meaning this is the title, the Mishnah, right? In terms of the structure of the Mishnah, sometimes the Mishnah gives you a headline, here are all the blank, and then it gives you a list. So this Mishnah says, here are all the people who, if they transgress in the following ways, the death penalty that's imposed by the court is strangulation, one of the four types of death penalty. And the first item on the list is one who strikes his father or mother. And that's what we're going to dig into a little bit today. We spent some time in the chapter on Ben Sower Mored, the rebellious child. So we know that both from the Torah and then the laws in the Mishnah, right, that the Torah in particular is strict with the standards that it holds children to about how they treat their parents, and there are ways in which certain kinds of violations can earn some serious penalties. We saw how in the case of Ben Sower Mored, the rebellious child, while the Torah has a broad category of what children and parents could decide to punish by death, the rabbis narrowed that in that case. And here we're going to talk a little bit about this, though, not in the category of the extra special rebellious child, but just striking your parents is a capital offense in the Jewish legal system, and we see it in this Mishnah today. And we're going to dig into a little bit, see some pieces related to this crime and the penalty that comes with it. So the Gemara starts by asking a question. It asked a lot. Having given the rest of the list, it restates the first thing on the list: one who strikes his father or mother is executed by strangulation. And then the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this halacha? A normal question in the Talmud to ask: where does this particular law come from? This is one of those cases where we find out exactly what question the Gemara is asking only after we see the answer. Right, it's a generic question, right? Mina hane mile or mina lan are the two ways the Gemara asks it often in Aramaic. Where do we derive this halacha from? It means, tell me this thing we found in the Mishnah. What verse in the Torah does it come from? And the law was, right, striking a parent makes you executed by strangulation. And then we see, here's the verse. The verse from Exodus 21:15 says, one who strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. So the Torah is pretty explicit here, stating the crime and the penalty that goes with it. And the Gemara adds to this, and every death stated in the Torah without specification is referring to nothing other than strangulation. So I just want to note, when you first see the question, where do we derive this halacha? It could just be, where do we derive the halacha that you read there's the death penalty for hitting a parent? But once you see the verse is pretty clear. It says, right, that you get the death penalty for hitting the parent, which nuances what the original question was, which is specifically about the topic of the Mishnah, the assignment of a particular death penalty to the to the crime. You reference the verse, but if you notice, the verse doesn't say anything about which death penalty is there. And so in some ways, while this verse tells us that striking a parent is a death penalty, it doesn't indicate which of the death penalty it provides. And the answer to the question isn't really a biblical verse. It's the rabbinic principle that says, if the Torah doesn't state specifically what death penalty you get for a particular crime, then we go to the death penalty of strangulation. It's sort of the catch-all category, right? If the Torah is non-specific, if the Torah indicates that something is a capital crime but doesn't tell us what the penalty is, the rabbis decided it goes to strangulation. So it's an interesting little short piece of Gemara here. It's a question they always ask: where does this halacha come from? It gives us a verse that's pretty clear, stating that we have a capital offense. But really, if the question is, how do we know it's strangulation? The answer doesn't come from the verse, but this principle, which is the fact that the verse doesn't specify. It puts this crime in this category and lands it in this Mishnah on Sanhedrin 84, which we read this week. All right, that starts us off, and we're going to move forward. Hang on, clicking the slide. There we go. The rabbis ask an interesting question about this in the Gemara, and it starts to explore what are the limits, what are the boundaries of this. And they say a dilemma was raised by the sages. What is the halacha with regard to whether a son may let blood for his father? Right, the Gemara says, right, we have this not a medical technique in use anymore, right? Bloodletting was a thing that people did to try to heal them. If you're sick, not so many centuries ago, people thought like the diseases must be in your blood, and if we bleed you out, you'll get better. We do some blood transfusions someday for some diseases today. So while bloodletting we don't do anymore, there is a way. Certain things are cured by replacing blood still today. Anyways, they say, wait, how do we know though, if you can't strike your parent? Maybe, says the Gemara, we have this problem. You can't do a medical treatment that involves wounding your parent, right? The act of letting blood, where you have to take some kind of sharp object and cut through the skin so that somebody bleeds. And if you're not allowed to strike your parent, perhaps you're not allowed to treat your parent through this technique of bloodletting because it's striking, and that's a capital offense. We have two possible explanations that the Gemara brings to say why medical treatment is an exception, right? Striking for the purpose of medical treatment might be a different reason. Rav Matna quotes a famous verse from the Torah, Leviticus 19:18, right? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the logic behind that is, right, if you were needed medical treatment and needed to be cut for it, and the person around to do that was your child, you would want your child to give you the medical treatment and not skip the medical treatment. And since you would want this to happen for you, it must be okay than to allow a child to cut their parent right in this medical procedure to let blood under this principle of v'ahavta l'orecha kamocha. It's good midrashic logic. It's good rabbinic logic. What's interesting to me about the quote of this verse here is all the different ways that this verse has shown up in Sanhedrin. We saw it a lot in terms of the discussion of how the death penalty works. Like why do we do different procedures? Right? There's the reason why the rabbis say you immediately after a trial bring someone out and execute them immediately after they've been found guilty, or the reason they give for why when you stone somebody you push them off like um, a, a, a cliff or I'm not thinking the word. You have to build a stand like above the ground and you push them off at a certain height. The rabbis say, why do we do all these things? There, the context, the explanation is right. If you were the one being put to death, you'd want it to be quick and as painless as possible. So that's why we have these descriptions of death as quick, as painless as possible. It struck me as an odd context for the use of that verse. I get the logic that it's true. Once convicted of the death penalty, which you're going to meet the ultimate fate for your crimes, reduce the amount of suffering that the person who's going to be put to death, which is no penalty greater than that, reduce their suffering to zero after they've been committed and execute them as quickly as possible. Makes sense to me. I thought it was interesting that a verse that we think of as about kindness isn't always it was an odd setting for that. Here we see it, just a few pages later in this other context that says, the exception, you're not supposed to strike your parent. You're not supposed to harm your parent right through physical means. But if it's a medical treatment because your parent would want, this is what you would want to do, we can generalize it and say it's an exception to the rule. And this treatment, bloodletting is okay for a child to do to their parent because the parent, that's what they would have wanted. That's what we all would want. We want to waive the you can't strike your parent rule to allow for the treatment. So that's one possible explanation. A second explanation the Gemara brings comes from Rabbi Bar Chanina, who says, well, we derive this from the juxtaposition between one who strikes a person and one who strikes an animal. Let me jump ahead one slide to show you what he's talking about. Leviticus 24:21 says, and one who strikes an animal shall pay for it, and one who strikes a person shall be put to death. So note here, there's a verse in Leviticus that says, right, striking an animal has a penalty, striking a person has a penalty. And while the penalties are different, one is cost and one is the death, right? One is a fine and one is the death penalty. The rabbis have a number of things in our chapter, in our week, actually this week, where they draw a parallel. Since this verse has in it both rules about striking an animal and striking a person, even though the rules are different, even though the end is different, that the penalty is different, that we can still learn what's true in one case is true in another case. Let me go back to Rabbi and who says, because of the juxtaposition of these two things in the verse, we see that just as one person strikes an animal for medical purposes is exempt from paying restitution, so too one who strikes a person for medical purpose is exempt from liability. So why do we have this exemption that you're allowed to strike a parent if it's part of a medical procedure? Because we know that's the rule for animals, right? If an animal needs care, you're not allowed to strike an animal. If you were to strike and injure another person's animal, you have to pay a fine. But you're allowed to treat an animal medically, even if it involves some kind of striking, and you're exempt from restitution, and the exemption that applies in the case of animals applies in the case of people as well. And this is where Rob Dimi explains the rule that for medical procedures you're allowed to waive this striking prohibition, right? A child may let the blood of their parent for a medical procedure without penalty, right? Which is what the case is what we do with animals, we do for humans as well. Interesting to note that right, while we saw in the going the wrong way. In the previous slide, right, we have this verse in Exodus: one who strikes a father or mother shall be put to death, right? Striking someone, right, that it causes the death penalty. The verse that we used to compare the animal case with the human case also says, right, it's not just children hitting parents that can be put to death. It's anyone striking anyone carries the death penalty. It's an interesting piece that we're focused here because we're focused on the list of, right, what death penalty you get. They have parents striking children, not people striking people. Although, based on the rabbi's rule, this should be the same death penalty because it doesn't say what kind of death penalty you get here. And if it's generic, should be in the same category, striking in general. So it's interesting that we're drilling down just on the parent case and not the generic case. Anyways, that's a little aside. Coming back to the conversation in the Gemara. So we determined that for medical procedures, it's okay to do a medical procedure on your parents, even involves some kind of, you're injuring someone in order to heal them. But then we have two stories that the Gemara brings that shows that while it's the rule that it's okay, here's some examples of when the rabbis didn't follow the rule. This is a case which happens both in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, where sometimes the anecdote that comes to show what happened in the case, the legal situation that we're talking about, where the rabbis don't actually do what the law permits them to do. And sometimes, right, these are seen as cases that sort of contradict the rule. And it's a pattern. We see this a lot in both Mishnah and Gemara, that sometimes the story that comes tells us a different story, I guess pun intended, from what the legal section did before. So this says, Rav did not allow his son to extract a thorn from him due to the concern that his son would unwittingly wound him. And Mar, the son of Ravina, did not allow his son to pierce his blister, lest he would wound him, which would be an unwitting violation of a prohibition. So we saw above that, right, we had two different reasons, whether it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha or because of this juxtaposition about animals and people in the other verse from Leviticus. The rabbis derived that it's okay if a child has to cause an injury to their parents in order to heal them, you can do that. Both Rav and Mar, the son of Ravina, prevented their children from doing a procedure that might injure them because they, even though it was unwitting, right, even though it wasn't intentional, right, the intent was to heal, they did not want to put their children in a case where they might unwittingly harm them. And even though we saw the legal tradition and the discussion just before that said it was okay. So Rav suffered with the thorn that, right, he had a splinter. One had a splinter, one had a blister. They had a treatment before them. Maybe their kid was the only person around to be able to do it, despite the fact that we have these two midrashim giving permission for this to happen. These two rabbis say, nope, we're going to be extra careful here. We're not going to let this happen. And the Gemara continues and says, well, if this is a concern, right? If this is a concern that these rabbis are saying, like, should this be concerned if someone's not a son who treats them, right? We saw the verse that said anyone striking anybody could cause the death penalty. And here, if we see these two people not let their children doing it, why are we limiting it to children? Shouldn't we be concerned that anybody who treats somebody else and has to injure them as part of the healing process, right, has to cut the skin, has to do something to heal them, what would happen, right? It should be a concern not just in the parent-child, but a situation should be a concern in any of the medical situations. The Gemara says, when another treats him, the concern is that the individual would be in unwitting violation of a prohibition. By contrast, when the son treats him, the concern is that he would be unwitting violation of a prohibition that is punishable by strangulation. And here comes into the difference between, right, what happened, the severity of it. If someone unwittingly injures a person while treating them, right, they are violating a prohibition. But the rabbis here are saying it doesn't rise to the level of when it's a child and a parent. And there might be a reason for us to take extra care in a situation like the two rabbis did in those stories, when it's your child who's treating you. Because the punishment for violating this prohibition, if you strike your parent, is strangulation, which is seen as more severe, but in the normal unwitting case, that wouldn't be the same. It's not the same level. of punishment. And there's a severity here that we're going to be extra careful with parents and children. And that's maybe why these rabbis went this, denied treatment from their child, is when they might allow someone else to, to cut them, to remove the splinter, et cetera, because when the level of violation, the level is less, the level of the prohibition is less severe, right? It's just an unwitting violation of a prohibition generically in the case of just a person to person, but it rises to the level of strangulation when it's parent to child. So that's some of the ins and outs of what we studied this week. We see the rabbis look at this law about one of the things on the list, right? We have this conversation about the other things on the list as well, about parents striking children. We see some ways in which they try to expand and or limit it, and we saw some of the different ins and outs of the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you and see. I see we're 30 plus comments in the chat today. Some of those might be a hello. I don't know what the other ones are. I wasn't able to follow, but I'm excited to see what questions you might have, or if there's something we want to call out from the chat. We'll see what you want to ask, what you have to say in the minutes we have left.
Folks, go ahead and put your hands up too if you'd like something to share something. Lynn had a question that I thought was a good one, a good theoretical question for us to ponder for a few minutes. About these execution methods in general. And Lynn, I'm scrolling up and having trouble finding your question. But the essence of it was, our methods for kosher slaughter are also designed, presumably, there's a presumption there that we might want to look into, to minimize pain and suffering. Why don't we execute people that way?
But why don't we use the same procedure? We should execute people.
Right, Lynn, is that a fair, is that a fair summary of the question?
Yes, I just said, the way we slaughter animals is very quick, and they die really fast. So I just wondered why the rabbis cooked up these horrible methods when you could just slit their throat and they would exsanguinate quite quickly.
Yeah. That's a great question, Lynn. So one factor if you're asking why the rabbis did this, one of the factors that led to having 4 different types of death penalty is because there are cases in the Torah where the Torah specifies a particular kind of death penalty, meaning certain capital crimes the Torah says this person is stoned to death. So that would rule out, execution with a blade. That's sort of why we have 4 different categories. But one of the categories is right. Hereg is right, death by blade, and so within that category, your question's a really good one. Why are these procedures different, and why not use a system that we use when slaughtering animals? And that's a wonderful question.
And could I just come back to that also? These rabbis were so good, and we know this after 5 years, that even though the Torah specified stoning or some other method, the rabbis would be very good at just twisting the argument around to a humane method if they wanted to.
Yeah, I got that. And it depends. It's the text that gets called out a lot about Masechet Sanhedrin is the text where the rabbis say, a court that has more than X number of executions in X amount of time. I'm not remembering the exact numbers, so I don't want to say it wrong. But right, if there are too many death penalties issued in too fast a time, right, that's known as a bloody court. And there's a way in which the rabbis believe that the death penalty is excessive, right? Some of the rules about when you get to applying the death penalty have narrowed the situations where you can apply it, meaning the level of testimony you need and all the conditions they put, right, reduce the amount of times to apply the death penalty as down as far as they can. So one way you might think about it is, the exploration of the death penalty, right? We know also about the rabbis where they take a verse or they take something that's a Torah and they'll talk about it for pages and pages and pages, more theoretically than actually. And once they start looking at the verses and explaining the verses and saying, what's there, it sort of expands and gets away with itself. It could be that a lot of this conversation was academic and this wasn't the way that the death penalty happened at all, if the rabbis actually ever did or had the power to use the death penalty. So in that sense, might be true. But I think what you're saying is the rabbis made a choice to design what they designed, and there are alternatives that could have been different. The one thing I saw, someone sent me a blog. I feel like it's a blog called Talmudology. I might not have the right name, but it's a person who's writing
That is a blog.
It is. It's a blog about Daf Yomi. It's not every page, but the person who writes it is a medical professional. Someone sent me a blog from Talmudology, I think, about the stoning piece where the rabbis have this whole debate about how high does the platform have to be for the person to fall. And the medical analysis they provided in this blog actually argued that what the Talmud said, like the writer took ER data to say at a lower height, we know from ER data based on how, what height someone falls from, whether they're likely to be, safe, break a limb, severely injured, or killed. And he lined that up with what was in the Talmud and showed that actually, if you're going to stone, if that's how you're going to do stoning to death, the way the rabbis thought about designing the height of the platform actually lines up with what we know of anatomy and physiology about making something that is going to be, pushing someone off that platform is done in a way that will cause an instant death, as opposed to a horrible injury that they have to suffer through the pain afterwards. So I don't know if that makes it any better, Lynn, but you could Google Talmudology and stoning or platform or something, and maybe you'll be able to find it and take a look. I wish I had the link more handy, but as you know, a page a day for 7 years, like it's hard to keep all the different facts and things you pick up in your brain fresh and center. Thanks for the question, Lynn.
Thank you. Okay, let's do one more. There is a question here that feels like a very contemporary question about what about cases where you have an abusive parent and a child is striking a parent in self-defense?
Oh. That makes me think of in the conservative movement's new machzor for Rosh Hashanah. I think it maybe made it into the Siddur also. There's a piece about that for Yisker, like right at the memorial service you say for parents and other close relatives that have died. Like there's some liturgy that somebody wrote that got inserted into the Siddur to say, like, how do you say the memorial prayer for a parent who is abusive? So that question makes me think of that situation, which separate from the death penalty, right, is more, right, people who had challenging relationships with their parents because of the way their parents treated them. How do we still, what are the ways we, if at all, should modify mourning rituals and things to be able to deal with that? So I appreciate that question and know that people have that, right?
Depending on the severity of the abuse, could the parent be considered a rodef?
I imagine. I mean, as far as I know,
a rodef we saw a few days ago is one who pursues with the intent to kill,
right.
And for taking immediate action against them.
Right. If you're being pursued, right, you could do that. We've also seen some things, or I can't remember if it's coming forward. I'm a few days ahead of my reading about like sort of if someone intrudes into your home, you're allowed to defend yourself. So like if you had your own room and someone came in, like there are like self-defense is a factor. I don't think this question is addressed head on in the Talmud itself. I imagine there's literature about it post-Talmudic. So I don't want to speak for the rabbis on this, as I haven't.
We have encountered Talmudic texts on what parents owe their children. That parenting is not a free-for-all, and your child is not somebody you can treat in absolutely any way you wish. But I think also you're right that, and some of these commenters who are commenting are right, that notions of acceptable parenting in ancient times don't necessarily match what we would like to see today, and definitions of abuse might be different. And that
Right.
is why we need rabbis today, right? That is why we need
Right.
continual interpretation of the tradition.
Right. I mean, like, you know, adults striking children as discipline was, we have texts about that just, in the educational setting in the Talmud, where like you can slap a kid on their wrists for not paying attention in the Beit Midrash. So it says a Talmudic text. Don't splice the video of this on YouTube to quote me. Just keep that in context, please. So there are, we know from all the things we studied in Masechet Nashim about parents being able to arrange marriages for their children at really young ages. So like the standards of what we expect of parents and how they behave towards children is much higher. I would imagine, but we know, right, that self-defense is a concept that the rabbis recognize and talk about in other contexts. And I imagine thinking about if a parent is, physically threatening a child and a child strikes back in self-defense, that contemporary halakha would have progressed parallel to the way, civil law has with that. Just outside my area of expertise to be able to cite where and how. But I would imagine that's the direction Jewish law moved as well.
Well, that is a heavy place to end, but we are all heading into Purim tonight, the night of V'nahafochu, when things turn upside down and tragedies turn to joy. So I will wish all of you, if you're fasting today, for Ta'anit Esther, an easy fast and a joyful experience of reading the Megillah tonight, and a happy Purim, Purim Sameach. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow, as always. That is to all our friends who are not in Jerusalem. You have another day to wait, of course.
Right. I might, Rachel, I think, unless this changed, we should remind people who are in this class who will also do the weekly Parshat HaShavua class. I believe because of Purim, there's no Parshat HaShavua class tomorrow.
I should know that, but I don't. So if
I
you are
was in
signed up for
Parshat
those
HaShavua
emails,
class last week, and so
watch
people
your
Parshat
email
HaShavua
space
person, check it out.
for that. If you are looking for a Megillah reading, My Jewish Learning has an online Megillah reading that's available on I think it's right on our homepage right now. Pretty accessible to find. And wishing you all Purim Sameach, and we will see you soon.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.